Kia ora tātou. Welcome back everyone. Good morning. I hope everybody had a good night last night. Whatever path you may have picked for dinner, I hope it was a good one and that you got home in good shape. Thank you for being here in a timely fashion this morning. Before we start the formal activities today, we have a small reward for you for your timely behavior yesterday. Thank you. As you will all know, Wellington is the capital of creative economics. We're going to present you a few ideas for raising money from the next generation of creative Wellingtonians.
We can get money from selling oil, gold, and the crystals.
That's a very good idea.
I saw that in a movie I watched.
What movie was that?
The Muppets.
What do you think of that movie?
Some really good songs, weren't there?
Yeah.
What do you like? Did you like the songs or not?
Yeah.
Really? Kind of.
Miss Piggy just wears wigs all the time.
What about the songs?
Me
Yeah,
Party.
they're so good.
You think so?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel they're very derivative of like other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can go to another person's house and then we can ask if we can borrow some money and we can give them some more money back from us. It wouldn't be the same money which they gave to us.
So we get some of them, but give them some back.
Yeah.
But not as much.
Yeah, but not as much.
Are you suggesting that to get money we catch robbers
And
and take the money from them?
yes. First you have to make a trap. We can get the money out of his pockets and then we can give it to the sick children. We could save the money from the tooth fairy and then and we could ask other kids for their teeth so that we can get even more money. Make like a little bowl into a big bowl, a giant bowl, so we can throw all of our teeth in.
We need parents to make more kids, so
Yeah.
there'll be more money because there'll be more teeth.
Yeah,
It's kind of
that's what the collusion is.
How many kids could your parents make?
My parents made 2,
That's good. It's
but
good
my
start.
mum and dad don't want to make more. Yeah, and my mum always says no, 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 no more kids.
It's now my pleasure to introduce the Minister for the Environment, the Honourable Amy Adams, who will begin proceedings today and has a very tough act to follow.
Nau mai haere mai, good morning and welcome to day 2 of the Valuing Nature Conference. You're right, that's an incredibly tough act to follow. Flight of the Conchords are a lot more witty and watchable, I'm sure, than what I've got to say, but I can tell you I'm sure a lot of those kids are going to grow up to work at Treasury, judging by some of their ideas. Okay, so yesterday you heard about the economics of nature and about valuing nature at a local level. Today the focus is on natural capital in a national context and in business. Now this is particularly pertinent to me in the environment portfolio, where it's my job to lead the work around taking a good, hard look at the way we manage our natural resources, and in particular, our fresh water. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the valuable input of my colleague Nathan Guy and the officials at the Ministry for Primary Industries who are working with the Ministry for the Environment and others across the natural resources sector on what is the most comprehensive reforms for freshwater management that we would have seen in a generation. So this work is currently focused on the need for greater government direction and at the same time enabling communities to make decisions that will grow our economy and look after the natural capital that we all know is the bedrock of our wealth and of our competitive advantage. So today I'm going to announce the decisions the government has made to start improving the way we manage our freshwater resources and then give you a flavour of the work that's still to come. The issues with our freshwater management have been well traversed over the years. We all want to be confident that the system is looking after what is our most important resource. Already we've had to spend more than $450 million to clean up some of our most iconic rivers, lakes and wetlands. It would be so much better, though, if we prevented the pollution of our waterways in the first place, rather than leaving our children and grandchildren to face a legacy of poor water quality and ever-increasing cleanup costs. We all, I think, want an end to the conflict, the delays and the costs that many of us face when planning for activities that use or affect our fresh water. It seems that all too often, water disputes are determined by who has the best lawyers or the biggest checkbooks, and in the long term, the health of our waterways have not been well served by this approach. It has to be time to stop focusing on the issues that divide us rather than the values that we all share around the water that we enjoy. As our population grows and our land use intensifies, the time is long overdue to reassess our approach to managing water. There is simply too much at stake if we don't take action. So it's probably trite to say that New Zealand's economy depends on our productive sector, which of course depends very much on water. We produce fruit and vegetables worth more than $5 billion a year. Dairying earns $13 billion plus a year in exports, and tourism earns us more than $10 billion a year. And that's not even to speak of the contributions from pastoral farming, forestry, and a number of other sectors. But this isn't, of course, just about the dollars. Horticulture employs more than 50,000 people, and the dairy sector more than 45,000. So that's just between two sectors, more than 95,000 people and their families that rely on access to fresh water. So paradoxically, I've always thought that water is both a renewable and a limited resource. We need better tools to manage it, and we need to consider whether the decisions around water management are being made at the right level and with the right community inputs. To deal with these challenges, we are facing difficult decisions. We have to consider and make trade-offs between the many and often conflicting values that we hold around water. It is, after all, a shared and public resource. There is also the difficulty that when we talk about balance in the context of resource management, it starts to feel like there's a perception that we have to pit the economy against the environment. This isn't an either-or question. We want to be able to apply the broad judgment that was originally intended under the Resource Management Act. Our economy depends absolutely on our environment. Equally, a strong economy gives us the ability to address environmental concerns. This is and must be about the economy working with the environment. But we are, of course, facing increasing risks to both. In addition, it seems to me that we all have a responsibility to ensure that we're using our natural resources in a way that is fair to the generations of New Zealanders that are still to be born. Maintaining the status quo carries significant and increasing costs. The government has recently, for example, committed a further $3 million to ensure the long-term protection of Lake Taupo's water quality, taking the total government investment in that lake alone to $35.5 million. Together with money provided by Environment Waikato and the Taupo District Council, this forms a total joint fund of over $75 million. But that funding is not the cost of cleaning up the lake, but the cost of achieving a 20% reduction in the nitrogen going into the lake to ensure its long-term health. Pollution resulting from poor management or poor decisions in the past can take decades to show up in our waterways. So it's very likely that things in many places will continue to get worse before they get better. Water is a key ingredient of our economic growth, but the value we get from it is not just about the economy. It's also about our water's value in sustaining life and for recreation and the role it fills in our national identity. It is clear to me that we need to make changes if we're going to continue to benefit and enjoy it. The government has been working on a package of cohesive reform that will lead to more productive and sustainable use of our freshwater resource within a generation. This work started in 2009 when we asked the independent stakeholders in the Land and Water Forum to agree on the problems and to start coming up with some ways to tackle them. This was the genesis of the Fresh Start for Freshwater reforms. In 2011, we progressed the forum's recommendations by introducing the first of 3 initiatives. We introduced a limits-based regime for freshwater management through the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management. A key requirement of the NPS is that overall water quality in all regions must be either maintained or improved. Our second initiative was to put $15 million over 2 years into a special fund devoted to partnership agreements with councils and communities to clean up 6 lakes, rivers and wetlands. And thirdly, we set up the Irrigation Acceleration Fund. In this year's budget, the government has committed $80 million to invest in regional irrigation schemes as the first stage of its commitment to invest up to $400 million. Building on the recommendations in the 3 reports of the Land and Water Forum and on ongoing advice from iwi leaders, the government released a discussion document on a comprehensive and integrated package of reforms for freshwater management in March of this year. More than 2,000 people attended 50 meetings in hui across the country in March and April to let us know their views. I'm happy to report that across the country and across sector groups, there was broad support for the overall direction of the water reform package. Today, I'm pleased to announce that the government intends to introduce amendments to the Resource Management Act in a bill to be introduced to the House this year to begin to deal with those issues. First and foremost, the government accepts the Land and Water Forum's recommendation that we should include a collaborative planning option for freshwater management. Currently, council staff tend to draft a plan and then consult on it, which is described by some as a decide, announce and defend approach, which is then often followed by years of litigation. Instead, we will provide an option where people and organisations drawn from the community can work together, reflecting their diverse values and setting objectives and limits for their local freshwater resources. Councils and communities that invest time and energy in the early stages of the planning process are more likely to produce better and more durable decisions because of that input. Getting agreement up front in the planning process will mean, we believe, less litigation further down the track, which should increase certainty for everyone and ultimately save considerable time and money. We're not going to be compelling councils to choose a collaborative approach. Regions will still be able to use the existing Schedule 1 planning process if they choose. However, feedback on our proposals for freshwater reform tells us that there is significant support for going down the path of collaborative planning. Now, collaboration depends very much on the incentives being right for all those engaged at all stages of the process to work towards the best outcomes. And getting those incentives properly calibrated in the design of the system has been a critical part of the exercise. Limiting appeals is one of the key tools for fostering consensus and incentivising upfront engagement, as are ensuring that residual appeal rights are appropriately tethered to deviation from the collaboratively reached decisions. An important feature of this planning option is the flexibility in how collaboration can operate region by region. It's critical that the government provides guidance and support as councils and communities adopt to this new way of working towards success. Additionally, we think it's important that we also clarify and enhance provisions for iwi views to be explicitly considered before planning decisions on freshwater are made, no matter whether councils choose to use the new collaborative option or the existing Schedule 1 process. We accept that the current regime is not working as intended for Māori, and that while final decisions are reserved for councils, those decisions must be properly informed by all relevant information, including iwi views. There are many examples of iwi participating successfully in the freshwater management processes, but I'm also hearing that there have been differing expectations and some widespread confusion about their role and how it should operate. This has led to uncertainty, costs and delays while matters are debated in the courts, and some iwi have looked to Treaty of Waitangi settlements to ensure that their interests are properly considered. Now, I want to stress that where those treaty settlement agreements are in place, they will continue to be protected under the framework. The iwi Leaders Group have worked directly with me on these reforms, and I was gratified by the keen interest and positive response from iwi throughout the consultation hui in March and April. As I've said, central government will work closely with regional councils to provide guidance and best practice information for implementing these changes. We're all in this together, and your input as players in this field is critical. Whether you're from a regional council, an environmental organisation, an iwi group, or the productive or energy sectors. The Ministry for the Environment is working with regional councils and scientists to improve the quality and consistency of the data that we need to underpin sound decision-making on freshwater use and management. National requirements of the process will continue to be provided for through the National Policy Statement on Freshwater Management, which gives councils clear direction to maintain and improve the quality of water in their catchments, as well as through use of the EPA to assess and progress nationally significant consents and water conservation orders to protect our wild and scenic rivers. Despite the recent debate, I want to emphasise that we had not proposed to make any changes to existing water conservation orders, nor to reduce the important protections that they provide. Rather, what we had discussed in the discussion document was making sure that any new applications would not be used to undermine or derail new collaborative efforts that we are fostering. However, following feedback during the freshwater consultation process, we've decided that given goodwill from stakeholders, there is a low risk of water conservation orders being used in this way. We will therefore give the reforms time to bed in before looking at whether there is any need to reconsider water conservation order processes. So at this stage, we will not be making any change to the water conservation order process. Other parts of the immediate steps for freshwater reforms include the creation of a national objectives framework and better water accounting. It's the government's intention to this year make legislative amendments to facilitate the introduction of a national objectives framework. In the meantime, work is continuing to progress the development of that national objectives framework, including detailed scientific work on populating the guidelines. A further period of consultation will be carried out before final decisions on the design and detail of the framework are made. Now, just before I finish, I want to touch on another area of work that complements the government's freshwater program, which is credible state of the environment reporting. The importance of this work was reinforced by last week's release of Statistics New Zealand's Environmental Domain Plan, which I know my colleague, the Honourable Dr. Nick Smith, touched on yesterday. The Domain Plan provides a useful picture of the official information about New Zealand's environment and identifies what can be done to make improvements to this information. The government is committed to introducing independent environmental reporting locked down in statute that is underpinned by high-quality, consistent statistics that provide a reliable, accurate, and integrated picture of the environment and the economy. Before we're in a position to do this, we need to address the current barriers to getting reliable, consistent data that provides that integrated picture. In the government's 2011 discussion document on environmental reporting, we signalled that changes to the Resource Management Act were required to enable the government to make regulations requiring local authorities and councils to monitor the environment according to specified priorities and methodologies. That work was completed last year, and changes to the Act are included in the Resource Management Reform Bill of 2012, which had its second reading in Parliament last month. It's essential that improvements to the quality and accessibility of data are made so that we can debate the issues rather than the integrity of the data. The Ministry for the Environment is currently in the midst of this work programme, with further announcements likely to be made later this year. So this year is an exciting one for all parties interested in freshwater management reform. As I've stated throughout this process, while the government will work at pace to formulate durable solutions, we recognise that these decisions are too important to rush. The government is committed to robust reform of freshwater management, so to everyone who has had an input and to all those who may soon become more involved, can I thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you very much, Minister. I'm now pleased to invite James Palmer, Deputy Secretary, Sector Strategy, Ministry for the Environment, to chair Session 3, Natural Capital in National Context. James?
Kia ora tātou and good morning, everyone. The Minister's announcements just now on the National Objectives Framework and freshwater policy, I think, marks a very significant moment in the evolution of environmental policy in New Zealand. The emphasis on social process as a way of sharing and generating new knowledge together, and in doing so, building the foundations for shared values, is a very different way of operating. We're getting away from, as we discussed yesterday, using knowledge as a weapon in contest and in conflict, as something that builds the basis for people to come together, work together, discover the issues in new ways, discover each other's values in new ways, and build the foundations for agreeing on strategy and ways of moving forward, all of which can result in more durable and resilient policy. The Land and Water Forum, and I know that there's many people in this room who contributed to the Land and Water Forum process, was all about sharing and generating new knowledge together, finding those common values and building the basis for agreement. It was challenging, hard work over a number of years, but I think has been hugely successful. Ministers have worked closely together to share perspectives, share knowledge, and to ask for new knowledge to be generated, and there's been a lot of that. The Minister touched on the natural resource sector agencies. This has been the most significant effort, cross-agency effort in policy development in the natural resource space in our history. We've had multidisciplinary, multi-agency teams located together, working together to again share and generate new knowledge. I'm conscious that there will be people in the room that won't have heard of the natural resource sector before. This is the group of government agencies responsible for natural resource issues in a range of different ways, and we work on an ongoing basis to collaboratively develop policy, to commission new knowledge, and to engage with stakeholders such as councils, the research community, and I believe there were over 65 scientists who have worked directly with those officials in providing advice to ministers, also with communities and business groups as well. This conference is all about sharing and generating new knowledge. Someone who has spent their entire career in the business of generating, but most importantly, I think, sharing knowledge, is with us to speak shortly. He's one of the great science communicators of our time. Sir Robert Watson earned his PhD in chemistry at Queen Mary College at the University of London in 1973, and since then has had a truly distinguished career. He was Director of the Science Division and Chief Scientist at the Office of the Mission to Planet Earth at NASA. He was the Associate Director for Environment for the Clinton administration in the White House. He was Director of the Environment Department at the World Bank and their Chief Scientific Advisor. He's been the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs for the British government. He chaired the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and is probably best known as the chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change between 1997 and 2002. Sir Robert is something of a rock star in the science world, and just yesterday he was telling me that he has recently been to Antarctica on a trip with Al Gore, Ted Turner, Sir Richard Branson, and a range of other movie stars, rock stars and the like. So he does keep that sort of company, but he's a very down-to-earth individual who has an enormously rich perspective of the global issues across a whole range of fronts, whether they be on climate, whether they be on water and food production, biodiversity. He has a truly global perspective. So we're extremely fortunate to have him with us today to help us generate new knowledge and to share in his perspectives. So I ask you to join me in welcoming Sir Robert Watson to the stage.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and after that introduction, the talk will be a total anticlimax, I can assure you. What I want to talk about today is a very narrow piece of the work. I was the co-chair of the UK National Ecosystem Assessment. What we did was we looked back 40 years to the Second World War to ask how had our ecosystems changed over those 40 or so years, why had they changed, how much of the habitats changed, what happened to the ecosystem services, and what were the implications for human well-being. We then looked forward the next 50 years to say, plausibly, what could happen in the UK to our ecosystems, and what, again, were the implications for human well-being. I'll only touch upon some of the trend data and the way we did it, and I'll focus mainly on how we looked at value and valuation. We had a construct where we had several hundred scientists, and when I talk about scientists, I mean economists, natural scientists, social scientists, wrote the 10 chapters. I had an expert committee, also mixed of an interdisciplinary team, overseeing the process. We had the client group, largely research councils and government agencies who funded it, needed to understand what they thought the key issues were, as well as the scientific community. And very, very important, I had a users group. Government officials, local to national, NGOs, development and environmental, and also had the private sector, such as water utility companies, the National Farmers Union, and they helped to guide what were the issues they cared about. What type of knowledge did they need? And we're now doing the second phase of the National Ecosystem Assessment. Even though I now live in the United States, I'm still co-chairing it with 2 other people. And again, we're working with all of the end users to make sure the type of knowledge we're generating is of value to them. And so it's very consistent with what the Minister said. Participatory processes are absolutely central. So fundamentally, we wanted to understand natural capital and its influence on policy making. We used a conceptual framework, which is very straightforward. It's a variant of what happened in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, where I was the board co-chair. We looked at the drivers for change, the indirect drivers, demographic change, economic change, social political change, technological change and behaviour. But then we looked at the direct drivers of change, overexploitation, conversion of ecosystems, pollution, land-based and water-based, introduction of exotic species, purposeful and accidental, and climate change. We asked what these drivers were doing to our ecosystems, to what degree had the habitats changed, what then changes in those ecosystems, how did they manifest themselves in changes in ecosystem services, how did they affect the provisioning of goods to we as human well-beings, and we looked then at the construct of human well-being, economic value, value to human health, and individual and shared social values. Some of this can be put in economic terms, some cannot, some is market value, some is non-market value, as we discussed quite a lot yesterday, basically. So you've seen this before. We looked at the whole range of provisioning services, the provisioning of food, the provisioning of water supply, of fibre, the regulating services such as climate, pollination, disease control, the cultural services, aesthetic, spiritual, educational, and the underlying supporting services. So this was our construct for doing our work. What were some of the key findings? Well, as you can see, we broke the United Kingdom into 8 habitats, all the way from mountains to urban areas to marine areas. And we asked ourselves, what was the current situation? Well, the overall bottom line is that about 35% of our services are still in decline, about 20% are improving, and about 45% are fairly flat. And as you can see, we analysed each of the various habitats. The woodlands, clearly nearly all improving. The water systems, however, still a great difficulty, possibly similar to some of the challenges you face in New Zealand, as mentioned by your minister just now. So if I pull it that, what happened? Well, why have we acted in the way we have? Well, after the Second World War, there's a great demand for food. And in fact, most of the United Kingdom is now been transformed into an agricultural system. In the UK, we only have 9% of forest cover. Nearly all of it is agricultural. So we really focused on provisioning services soon after the Second World War. The trouble is it came at a cost to other ecosystem services. In the last 10 to 20 years, I've said, some services are still declining, some are still improving, and you've already seen that in the previous slide. So what are some of the key messages? There's absolutely no question ecosystems and their services, the full range of services from provisioning to regulating to cultural and supporting, are critically important to human well-being and economic prosperity. Absolutely central. Unfortunately, they're totally undervalued in most economic analysis and in most decision-making. Most decision-making simply looks at the market value of these services and fails to take into account the non-market value. I've already said that ecosystems and their services change constantly, both due to the direct and indirect drivers of change. I've already said that we have tried to maximise those provisioning services that have market value since effectively the 1940s. And effectively, what has been happening is a major change in national and European Union policy and some good technological developments in the last few years. So things are better now than they were 30 or 40 years ago, but still, we've got a long way to go. As this says, we still have many of our systems that are not realizing their full potential, and therefore we have to understand what's the role of new policy, the role of technologies, the role of individual and collective behavior change in effectively transforming our systems into a sustainable future. It's absolutely crucial that we recognize that we have a growing population even in the UK, a change in wealth, and we're facing climate change, as is every other country in the world. So I will talk a little bit about climate change and some of the opportunities it presents and the challenges. Now, when I use the word opportunities, there are a few opportunities in the UK with climate change. Most of the world will absolutely suffer adverse effects of climate change, even for small changes in climate. Even small changes in climate in sub-Saharan Africa undermine food security, water security, health security, individual security, and adversely affect most ecosystems. In the UK, as we're a temperate climate, small changes in climate can have both some beneficial effects for some sectors and negative effects in other sectors. What we tried to do is ask ourselves, and I won't go into any detail, it's more to give you a flavour of what we did. We looked at a whole range of biodiversity groups, as you can see along the top, from microorganisms to fungi to lower plants, etc. And we asked ourselves the question, how important were they to a whole series of final ecosystem services, the provisioning, cultural and regulating services? Dark green means it's very important, light green, slightly less important, and if it's white, not particularly important at all. So we looked at the relationship of biodiversity and species in particular, and the various provisional services. Now, anyone can have this talk, so it will be left behind with the organisers, so anyone can actually request the talk if they want. Next, what we said is, okay, what were those 5 big drivers of climate change? Sorry, biodiversity change, as I've said. So it is indeed land use change, climate change, exotic species, pollution, and overexploitation. And we looked to see to what degree were those drivers affecting the various biodiversity groups. And you can see again, red means it was very important, all the way to being white means not important. We also asked ourselves, how good was our data? And the UK's got some of the best data probably of any country in the world, but as you can see, patchy, poor, poor, moderate, good, patchy, moderate. So it's very variable, and so we spent a lot of time looking at the quality of our data systems. We then asked ourselves the question, again, the 5 drivers for change, how do they affect our various habitats, our 8 habitats? Red means it was a very major driver for change since the Second World War, the last 40 or 50 years. All the way to yellow mean it was only a minor change, the green somewhere in between. The arrow says how important is it today. So if the arrow's going up, it means that that particular habitat is being affected by that driver even more today than it has been on average since the Second World War. If the arrow's going down, it means it's a decreasing driver. As you can see, climate change, in being the light yellow and very light yellow, sort of light green, has not been an important driver of change in the ecosystems in the UK over the last 50 years, nor has invasive species. However, if you look at the arrows on climate change, we project that over the next 50 years, climate change will become more and more important, potentially becoming the biggest driver of habitat change and effects on ecosystems in the United States. Went the wrong way, sorry. And then lastly, of these types of slides, this summarized 1,000 pages of writing, this one slide. And actually, most ministers actually understood it. It was actually quite gratifying. So again, we looked at our 8 habitats along the top. We looked at our various provisioning services and asked to what degree did a different habitat provide a particular provisioning, cultural or regulating service. Dark green means it was very important. So an obvious one, if I were to look, enclosed farmlands very important for crops. Self-evident, of course. Again, the arrows mean, were things likely to get better or worse, and are they getting better for worse in the last 10 or 15 years and likely in the next 5 or 10 years? And as you can see, some of the systems are going to get better based on what the policies are today, the use of technology. Some are clearly getting worse. And in fact, in particular, it is indeed our aquatic systems and marine systems. I think the water systems, we've got to pay the most attention to, basically. So this was the sort of information we got out of our document. Now, when we effectively looked to see what was happening, we then, of course, asked ourselves, why is this happening? Was it a change in policy? Was it a change in technology? Was it a change in behaviour? So we've got a good understanding of all of those trends. I now am going to talk much more about the future rather than the past, but it was critical not only to quantify those trends, but to understand those trends, whether it was a domestic rule or a European rule. So why would you bother with economic analysis? For a long while, the NGO community thought this was really not the way to go. Bolivia totally disagrees with this approach of trying to put value on ecosystems. They believe Mother Earth is Mother Earth, and it is absolutely ridiculous for we humans to try to even think of value, whether it's economic or non-economic. Well, you know, the market is a very efficient allocator of resources, as long as there's a market price. But many of these ecosystem services do not have price in the marketplace, and therefore the market is a very poor reflector of the value of some of these ecosystem services. Some have got no value at all in the marketplace, others are only poorly recognised, and some of the poorly recognised are some aspects of water quantity and quality, flood descent, some issues of recreation. None of these are truly well captured in the marketplace, and the reason is these systems have multiple services that we humans depend on, basically. And therefore, almost certainly, and certainly in the UK, and I'd assume the same in New Zealand, that most of the decisions made to date have been sub-optimum. We've focused on market value, we have not focused on the broader issues, basically. And therefore, in the long term, the decisions we've taken to date almost certainly not sustainable. So we looked at the various ecosystem services, and we said, look, some of these are so-called primary and intermediate processes, things like soil formation, nutrient cycling, biomass. Our view is you do not have to value these, and I'll say why in a second. We then, another group of services are final ecosystem services, the ecosystems that clean our water, produce our food, the trees that produce timber and energy for some water regulation. These are the so-called final ecosystem services, and these are the ones we need to value. The reason you don't have to value soil is it's expressed in our ability to produce food, or it's expressed in our ability for trees to grow. So we've differentiated between what we call the primary ecosystem services and the final ecosystem services. So then the question is, what do we humans get from our ecosystems? Well, we get drinking water. We get cereals, we get timber, we get flood protection. And so the question is, we need to say, what's the value of those? But we have to realise not all the value comes from the ecosystems. There's a lot of other capital inputs. So in other words, the value of the cereals that we buy has some value that comes from the ecosystems, the ability to grow food, but there's lots of other capital inputs, the harvesting, the other nutrients you put in the soil, the transportation to the supermarket, the packaging, etc. So when we looked at these various services, we had to say, what's the value of the goods? How much of it came from other capital inputs? And from that, we could actually work out the value of those ecosystem services. So we've done this in great detail, at least to the detail that we can with the current data. So that's our conceptual framework that we've used. So this is the same thing, but in a bit more detail. So the colour, as you can see in the top right-hand corner, what are the cultural services, the provisioning, the regulating and supporting? These are our primary and intermediate processes. Many of them are the supporting, the underlying processes, but also climate regulation, pollination can be viewed not as a final ecosystem service, but as a prime one. Reason? Pollinators, you can put a value on pollinators, but they're expressed in the value of the food that we buy, the ability to produce it. Then we've got our final ecosystem services, and you see the provisioning ones in blue, you see the regulating ones in dark red, and the green ones, which are cultural, meaningful places, wild species diversity. Many of these cannot be put into an economic framework. The meaningful value of sitting by a river, you feel good. Going to a forest, you feel good. It's good mental well-being. You can't necessarily put an economic value on. Some economists believe you can, and they try and do it, but it's far from an inexact science. So we're looking very particular at the cultural values, of which can't always be put into an economic framework, as well as those other issues that have both market and non-market value. Again, we looked at the goods, that and the other capital inputs. That then led to that, and that led to that. You've seen that in more detail. And the last bit is the big plus. The non-monetized values are absolutely critical. What we did in the first phase of the national ecosystem, and we're now digging into deep much more, is really spending time looking at the cultural services, the importance of place, the importance of meaning, the spiritual aspects, the aesthetics aspects, as well as the innate value. So we looked at things like mental well-being. We looked at just how you feel when you're in different locations. But we're also saying, is there a difference between individual value and shared values? And we're looking at the theoretical constructs of whether or not, if we aggregate what of all of you feel about ecosystems, is that the same as the shared value? And we're thinking it's not the same, and it's not my field of expertise, but doing a lot of work on it at the moment. Okay, so these are the various services that we want to value. So how do we do it? Well, the ones in red, they have market value one way or another. So we looked at a value of adjusted market value. We then said some of these others, such as the ones in blue, they contribute to output. So pollination, water quantity contributes to an output, so we use a different approach there. We then looked at avoided costs. In other words, if you have afforestation, reforestation, you put more carbon into the soils and in above ground biomass, it avoids climate change. So it's avoided costs of climate change, the avoided costs of pollution, land-based or water-based pollution. We then looked at observed behaviour, revealed preference. What are people willing to pay to have nice landscape, to have urban green space? How much are they willing to pay for recreation, and environmental effects on their health? So again, we use the idea of observed behaviour, revealed preferences. And last, and there was a question to Pavan yesterday, the issue of stated preferences. We also feel that there's some real issues about the approaches to stated preference. As Pavan said in the masterclass yesterday, you really have to frame the questions carefully, otherwise you just get rubbish out in the answers. So we use a wide range. Now, we look primarily at changes in value rather than absolute value. So, for example, we asked the question, what if we had more woodlands in the United Kingdom, and even more woodlands, and even more? What was the price per hectare, or the value per hectare of more woodlands? And relatively speaking, you see a flat line. And the reason is, it doesn't matter where in the UK you put your woodlands, it absorbs carbon, and it has basically the same price wherever you put it in the UK and how much you put. So basically, the more you sequester carbon, wherever it is in the UK, it's roughly got the same value. It does look like it's going down a little bit. But with recreation, I put some new woodlands near London, or Manchester, or Liverpool, or Cardiff. If there's not much there, has incredible value. Absolutely amazing recreational value. But if instead of putting one woodland, I put 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the additional value of each additional woodland gets a bit less, because in the end, people can't keep going to all the woodlands all the time. So the recreational value depends on the amount of different woodlands you put in place, but also in the location. And I'll come back to that later. If you put it near London versus the top of Scotland, a totally different value. So just as Pavan said yesterday, you have to look at the spatial and the temporal dimensions. We looked at an interesting study of Wales. This was done by Ian Bateman. What he asked himself was, if I were to convert the agricultural land in Wales to woodlands, do I gain or lose? So we converted all of the agricultural land in Wales to woodland, and we looked at what the timber values would be, and it depended a little bit on how well the timber grew. So in the central place, which is more uphill, it doesn't grow as well as around the coastal area. So we looked at timber value. We then asked ourselves about carbon sequestration. There's actually a complete correlation between timber and carbon. The more the wood grew, the more you had carbon sequestration, so you got a very similar pattern. We put a price on carbon. It was something like the European trading system. It's highly flexible at the moment. Just like in New Zealand, the carbon price has died. Why? There's no agreement of how to move forward on the Kyoto Protocol. Oops, sorry. We then looked at recreation, and the darker it is, the more it has recreational value. So it's in the south-east and the northeast. Why? In the northeast, you're next to Liverpool, and in the southeast, you're next to Cardiff. And this shows that for the same types of woodlands, the value is greatest in proximity to cities. And of course, we looked at farming, and effectively, what was the current value of farmland. We then looked at the net benefits and losses of conversion. If it's red, it means it was a bad idea to go to woodlands. If it was yellow to green, it was a good idea. What does this say? The whole of Wales should be a woodland. When Ian wrote this paper, he got hate mail from many people in Wales saying, "You bloody English colonialists, you're now trying to tell Wales what to do." Now, there's an underline, are the farmers stupid in Wales? No, of course not. Why? They have production subsidies from the European Union, and there is no price on carbon. So under the current system, the Welsh farmers are doing exactly the right thing. They're taking production subsidies from the Common Agricultural Policy, and they can't be rewarded basically by the carbon price. So this basically was, if we had a more rational world where you didn't pay farmers to produce, but you did value sequestration of carbon, then Wales should have a very, very different land use pattern. So we then said, okay, that's Wales today. Now let's look for the future across the whole of the UK. And so what we first did was said, well, we need some storylines. And so we came up with 6 plausible worlds. National security, world markets, local stewardship, go with the flow, which is largely business as usual, nature at work, and green and pleasant land. Well, what are they? You can't really read this. I'll just go back to the previous one, actually, and I'll talk about them. National security says we want to be more secure within the United Kingdom with respect to agricultural production, in other words, more food security, and even timber security. So we're going to be myopic and look into ourselves rather than rely on trade. Today in the United Kingdom, we grow about 65% of our food, 25% comes from the European Union, and 10% from the rest of the world. So what if we become more food secure? World Market says we don't care about the environment at all. We just want to maximize economic growth. We're going to even convert our green lands into new buildings if that works. We're just going to do the most to get agricultural productivity up and industrial productivity up. Local stewardship says we do care about the environment, but we're going to manage it locally, not nationally at a national scale. Go with the flow, literally business as usual, no more protected areas. Nature at work is we're not going to focus on any one ecosystem service. We're going to look at the ensemble of ecosystem services, the provisioning, the regulating, and the cultural, and we're going to try and optimize across all of them. You might guess this is the one I like. And green and pleasant land is, we actually don't care about economic growth. We just want to hug trees and protect all of the biodiversity we've got. Now, that's a caricature of them. They were way more complex. And so I'll focus on just 2 of them and compare the 2 of the more extreme scenarios. One, world markets, which, as I've just said, this basically really focuses on pushing for GDP growth, whereas nature at work tries to take balance between those biodiversity issues that have got non-market value as well as the ones that have market value. So when we looked at all of our provisioning, regulating cultural services, this is the end, and I'm going to come back to how we do value in a minute. What you see along the bottom, what you see is the various names, nature at work, local stewardship, etc. And if it's red or yellow, it's either declining, projected to decline, or likely to decline. If it's green, it's good. Well, what you see is nature at work on the left-hand side, local stewardship, green and pleasant lands are predominantly green and white, which means it's good. The ones on the right, world markets, national security, are predominantly red and yellow, which means we think they would be bad in the future. Now, before we started to do this work, we realized climate change is important. So we put some scenarios together for rainfall and for temperature. We used a high climate change and a low climate change. This one's a high climate change. And what it clearly suggests here, with respect to rainfall, that if anything, we'll get a little bit of a drying in the eastern part of the UK, and roughly a little bit more, about the same in the west. Temperature clearly will go up everywhere. The redder it is, the more the temperature would go up, but especially the east and the southern part of the UK would go up. We got way more sophisticated things that we did in the UK climate assessment. This is what Ian used in his model for these biodiversity scenarios. Okay, so what do we take into account when we try and do a projection? We broke the world being the UK, of course, into 2 kilometre by 2 kilometre grids. 2 kilometre by 2 kilometre, all over the UK. We feel high spatial resolution is important. We might even want to go less than 2 kilometres by 2 kilometres. We looked at the physical environment and its changes historically, and we projected the future. We looked at market forces, and we looked at policy. So, a key driver is how we farm, and that's taken into account in the model. That leads to food, it leads to income, so we look at both food production and incomes. We looked at impact on biodiversity, we looked at the impact on greenhouse gas emissions, and we looked at the impact on recreation. So we have theoretical modules for every one of those elements. So on agricultural production, the sorts of policy we looked at was at common agricultural policy reform, the role of subsidies, the roles of tariffs, the market forces for output prices, input costs and technology, historical and into the future, and environmental issues included issues such as soils, temperature and rainfall. To make sure we had the model working, on a 2 kilometre grid square, we looked from 1969 to today, over 40 years, at 2 kilometres square resolution, 50,000 farms of exactly how every square kilometre of the UK had been used for the last 50 years. We worked out what the land use was, how much wheat, barley, grass, what the livestock numbers were, the dairy numbers, the beef numbers, the sheep numbers, and effectively how new crops came in every year since 1969. And we asked, could we actually then simulate that with our model? And the answer was, that was our simulation of cereals. I should say ours, it was Ian Bateman's and his team, and that was the grasslands. Unbelievably well done. So they could not only put the data in, they then come up with theoretical models that would allow the model to respond to policy change, to climate change, to soil change, changes in crop technology. So that's what our basis was. So we felt reasonably comfortable we could move ahead. So the baseline was the current situation. So we looked at where were cereals, grazing land and beef in the UK at the top. And then we applied just one of our, at this particular slide, one of our future scenarios, nature at work, coupled with the high climate scenario, which we'd already modelled very carefully. And again, at a 2 kilometre by 2 kilometre grid, what would happen to cereals? And as you can see, under this particular nature at work, because we're optimizing across all of our ecosystems, there's actually a reduction in cereals, as you can see, especially in the eastern and southern part of the UK. There was an increase in grazing land, and there was also some increases in dairy herd. We then said to ourselves, okay, that's good, now we're getting the hang of this. Now let's look at what the impact of climate change and policy together on market values. And so we looked at where the world is effectively relative to today, market value only, so it's agricultural value, didn't bring in any other ecosystem services. What if we had a world of low emissions, that's low climate change, But every other environmental condition was a really strong environmental condition on land, on water, etc. High emissions was a large climate change, but again with strong regulations. And the last one was high climate change, but with almost getting rid of all of environmental regulations, just economic growth for the sake of economic growth. And as you can see, effectively, if you actually don't care about the environment and you've got a high climate world, it was all green. In other words, people say, this is really good. Our market value has gone up considerably, but boy, if we have strong environmental regulations, you know, there's a huge loss of market value throughout most of England, Wales, and parts of Scotland. So at that stage, you might say, boy, really do need to focus on the world market. So here we are again. This is world markets. This is nature at work. If I only look at market value, most of the UK is green, and there would be an increase in market value relative to today, taking discounting into account, of course. You'd get a gain of $420 million a year. Looks good. Whereas nature at work, you would lose $500 million. So is this the best option? So we said, okay, well, we've now done market value, and this is it here. Now let's look at some other things. Greenhouse gas emissions. Well, on the world market scenario, I've turned everything into agriculture. Not quite, but significantly. And I've got fertilizers, I've lost some of my forests. If anything, most of the country is effectively yellow or red. In other words, I've lost value. Whereas in the nature at work, I've really thought through very carefully how effectively to manage the land, and it's largely green. I haven't forced everything into market value and into agriculture, and so that is a much better world from an economic standpoint. So what about something else? What if I look at effectively recreation? Once again, world markets isn't very good. I've basically got rid of much of my urban green space, so you can see London's become very red. Just above Wales, it's Manchester and Liverpool, it's red. Newcastle's over on the other side, it's red. Literally, if I allow economics to drive my decisions, not only does it drive the way I use my land in the rural area, it drives even my decisions in green space, even within a city. Should I keep my parks? Should I keep my allotments? And so clearly, when you think through both economic and social value of the importance of parks, gardens, etc., again, once again, nature at work was better. We then did, of course, the urban green space in great detail, and once again, no surprises. I've just said nature at work is better. So we looked at all of these, and the one on the very right-hand side was we asked ourselves the question, what happened to biodiversity itself? Well, to be honest, there's loads of ways you can look at it. You can look at plant, you can look at species distribution, abundance. We just picked one parameter, and that was bird diversity. You could challenge that and say that's not a very good indicator of biodiversity. We decided it was at least an adequate one, but we don't put value on it. So in world markets, we asked what would happen to bird diversity under world markets, and most of the UK is red, as you can see, it's bad, whereas in nature at work it was largely good. So once again, even in a non-economic framework, nature at work was better. So where did this lead us? Well, if you take both market and non-market value into account, the world market scenario where you drive economic growth, minus 18, nearly 19 billion a year. If you look at all of your ecosystems together, plus 18 billion. The message is very, very straightforward to a policymaker. Don't just look at market value. Look at market value and non-market value, because that's the way to look at how you should manage your ecosystems. However, I forgot that one for a second. We note that even in a good world, the bird diversity was in some parts of the UK better under world markets than it was under nature at work. And therefore, the last part of the talk will be about how you should not have a national policy. It must be highly spatially disaggregated. So if you look at market value only, the best worlds were national security and world markets. If you look at all of the environmental values, it completely turns itself on its head, and nature at work and green and pleasant land are the way to go. Therefore, some very obvious, straightforward things you've already heard about, how we're still degrading, how we're not valuing all of our ecosystem service. The message is you must try and value all of those ecosystem services, those with both market and non-market value. Also, as I've stressed, cultural value and shared social values that can't always be put into an economic framework, basically. And by doing this, you can have much better approach to land management. This led to the first white paper or strategy on the environment in 20 years in the United Kingdom. And the basis is very simply, we need a landscape approach to managing the UK that seeks to optimise the multiple benefits from the land. I'm not going to go into this, it's on the website, you can look at it yourself. There's lots of actions, and the government is reporting back every 6 months on those particular actions. So we then moved on to the second phase, of which I am still co-chairing it, and our aim is to further develop this whole conceptual framework, look at the numbers. Do not take these numbers as absolute gospel. They're indicative of the numbers. I mean, it's not perfect knowledge by a long, long way, basically. So we're carrying on with, again, a very wide range of experts, a very wide range of end users to help to sort of inform what they think are the important issues. But another outgrowth of the first phase of the NEA is we put a natural capital committee together that directly reports to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and they're reporting every 6 months on what's happening to natural capital in the United Kingdom. The second phase of the UK, we have 4 large blocks of work, more economic analysis, and we're developing what is the approach, what is the right framework for doing a natural capital asset check. And it's not obvious exactly how to do it, so we're doing a lot of work on how do you develop that framework. Secondly, when I presented this work to some of the ministers, their very first question is, what does it do for jobs and economic growth in the short term? And we didn't have an answer because we had not looked at the macroeconomic effects. So we are now trying to understand the macroeconomic effects, short, medium and long term, of taking an ecosystem approach. And in work programme 3 is to continue exactly the sort of stuff I've already shown you, but putting an even larger emphasis on the marine ecosystems. We did not put much of an emphasis on the first phase, so we now put much more of an effort on both terrestrial and marine. We've looked at the cultural ecosystem services. What do we know about the cultural services? And fundamentally, what do we know about shared social values and plural values? Really looking into the theoretical underpinnings. To what degree are shared values complementary to individual values, or are they duplicative of individual values? How do you bring them into a decision-making framework? We looked at future ecosystem change by becoming more sophisticated in our plausible futures work. We've tried to analyse what are the right strategies, the policies, the technologies and the behaviour change to achieve a more optimal world. So what do we need to change in our policies, our technologies and our behaviour to more go to a nature at work world than some of the other worlds? And we've actually been trying to look at what are the barriers to incorporate these types of thought processes into policy making in government and decision making in the private sector and to the landowner. So we're trying to really understand barriers and opportunities to make this stuff useful. And lastly, we're looking at the tools. Rather than just putting all of this information out there, what are the tools that the private sector could use? What are the tools government could use? Valuation techniques, multi-criteria analysis, how to do plausible futures, etc. So that's the second phase. The first drafts of all the documents were released a couple of days ago for peer review. Oh, once again, going in the wrong direction. We use the same basic approach as the first time for every square 2 kilometres in the UK. How would the physical environment change? Market forces and policy. We went from a baseline today out to 2060. And the first thing we wanted to do again was to look very carefully at climate change. And this was the high climate change scenario. These were cereals, and this is the distribution of cereals in 2010. Blue means very little, red means far more. As you can see, as you go to 2035, we get more and more a climate suitable to cereals on the east part of the United Kingdom. So that is likely to occur. And therefore, that's it. Good information for the farmer, if indeed these models are correct, and do put an if there. What would happen to beef? Exactly the reverse. It gets less and less beef. Why? It's being displaced by cereals. What does it mean economically? If you put together carefully a strategy of where do you grow cereals, where do you raise beef, you can actually get it so you've got a win-win situation across all of the United Kingdom. So the challenge is, how do you do land use planning at the right spatial scale? Oops. So all this basically says is, we now want to look at a whole series of policies and choices simultaneously. So we don't say we've got one endpoint, how do we get there? We try and look right across all of our policies, our technologies, spatially, to say, how can you effectively improve the situation? Now, one question was, what would happen if you plant woodlands, or what if you wanted to improve water quality? So we are designing this model so it can answer some very specific questions for the policymaker. We use the six futures again, although they've been a bit more modified. And of course, doing futures is a social process. This is not a thing that you want scientists to do alone. You want to talk to the private sector. You want to talk with, with the private sector, with government, with the local landowner, with local councils. So it's a social process of what's your vision for the future. And it's very, very crucial to make sure it is totally participatory. So we did some policy targeting. What if you only wanted to maximise market value? Now, the colour in the maps is which scenario is best in which part of the UK. So I only want to optimise market value. It's very straightforward. Most of the UK, I would use red, world markets, or the darker yellow, national security. And indeed, what would happen to the economics? If I had that world, I'd gain 892 million, plus or minus maybe a factor of 2. If, however, I wanted to maximise market and non-market value, where would I apply the different worlds in different parts of the UK? Much of it would be nature at work, but some of it still would be national security. If I did that, so in other words, I make sure what policies are the policies I need for nature at work, what policies do I need for world markets, I mix those policies very spatially disaggregated. I don't have a common UK policy. I have ones that are very specific to different regions, and then I can gain 19 billion. Then I said to myself, what about if I take biodiversity into account? Because there are a few places where, when I look at market and non-market, I was still losing biodiversity. So we then put a constraint, you must not lose bird diversity anywhere in the UK. And so we then fine-tuned our scenarios, and we realized that you could make sure that biodiversity was not being lost anywhere in the UK by fine-tuning your policies at the 2-kilometre level. And you, instead of getting a 19.6 billion improvement, you got 18. So you could conserve biodiversity and optimize ecosystem services. And the key message again is you must look at market and non-market, and you can also take biodiversity into account. So what was new in the second phase? We optimized the various models. We really worked hard on them. And then we added the forestry module, the water quality module, and the way water quality and recreation play against each other. We then asked ourselves, well, now we've got a forestry model that we really believe at the 2-kilometre thing. What will happen on climate change to two very specific tree species, spruce and oak? And you can see 2010 and 2060, very straightforward. Spruce doesn't like a warmer climate, and so it would retreat, whereas oak would respond positively. Clearly, if we're going to plant more trees, which is the goal of the UK government, you don't plant spruce, you plant oak and other trees. We then looked what are the implications of that for the storage of carbon in live wood, in other words, the biomass in the ground. And we also looked about carbon wood products. And we sort of said, okay, we've got a rotation period, so we looked to see effectively how would carbon get accumulated, then you cut it, accumulate and cut. What would actually be in the biosphere, what would be actually in wood products. So again, one could look at what the carbon balance was in the UK, both within the ecosystem and within wood products. We then asked ourselves the question, well, what was this doing for soil carbon? And the two bottom lines are both basically highly organic soils. The very dark yellow line was undisturbed peat. The one slightly above it, the green dashed lines, was organic soils that had already been disturbed by agricultural practices before. And what you saw is if you were to do afforestation on these peat systems, especially if it had been previously an undisturbed peat system, all you do is lose carbon out of the system. In other words, really a bad idea to afforest an undisturbed peat system. If we looked at our clay soils, both previously disturbed through agriculture, which we are now afforesting or reforesting, or ones that were previously undisturbed, afforestation can be good. After an initial blip down, it can be good for soil carbon as well as above carbon. So again, if you're going to have a tree planting strategy like the UK has, you really have to think about soil type, whether it has or has not been disturbed previously. Again, going the wrong direction. We then asked, well, if we were going to do afforestation, reforestation in the UK, where would you get the greatest water benefits? Everywhere benefited, but some places benefited far more than others. So again, when thinking through a reforestation strategy, then you would say, boy, not only do I want to understand it from where I can get better timber, but what will the effect on water be, and what will the effect on that recreation be? This is the model that we used. It was policy, looked at the climate, agriculture, the carbon, the river quality, river recreation, biodiversity, forest carbon. So that was the model that we'd looked at of how would you reforest parts of the UK. So when we said, well, okay, we're going to plant oak, that's more resilient to climate change, where would you put it? If you only looked at market value, you'd put it on the left-hand side, a lot of it on the border of Wales and England, some of it up in northeast England. If I, however, wanted to target non-market value, specifically recreation, it doesn't show up well, but look at London. Around London, you'd plant a lot of trees around London. Why? The recreational value. Equally, you'd plant them around other urban centres. So the government had a policy, we want to plant more trees every year for the next 50 years. What this model was trying to do is say, okay, if you are, and you're spending the same amount of money, where can you get the maximum gains from both an economic and a non-economic point of view, or market, non-market, and also where do you gain it from cultural value? In other words, more places people can go and experience the outdoor. And the very last one then was, what did we learn from all this? Obviously, first, market price goods alone can result in bad decisions and lower overall value. All ecosystem services need to be understood when you have a policy change or a land use change. You need to look at the spatial and temporal variations in ecosystems and think very carefully about that. We need effectively to change an ecosystem flow should be valued whenever you have robust values. We haven't done all 25 services, reason we don't have good enough data. However, those things that are difficult to monetize, like wild species, can be incorporated, as I showed with birds, by putting sustainability criteria. Don't have to put value on it, you just put a sustainability criteria like no loss of bird diversity, for example. The key thing is spatial targeting is absolutely critical, basically, and we need to bring together the natural sciences with the economists, with the social sciences, if we're going to have informed decisions. Thank you.
You well and truly lived up to your billing, Sir Robert. That is truly outstanding. I have to say I'm a little bit breathless at this point. Being responsible for national level environmental reporting and as a policymaker in New Zealand, the depth of the work that's gone on there, the complexity of the tool, and your ability to convey what is an extraordinarily complex set of information and analysis in a very clear and compelling way is truly extraordinary.
The advantage is I'm not an economist.
Fantastic. We do have time. For a couple of questions for Sir Robert, and he will be giving a masterclass this afternoon at 3 o'clock. So there'll be more time for discussion then. But if there are any questions now, we'd love to hear them. Please, if you could come on down.
The Thank you very much. I was very interested in the comment that you made about the reporting to the committee, the 6-monthly reporting to the committee, and I wonder if you could expand on some examples of policy changes that flowed from the reports or the advice that you gave.
Yeah, none at the moment, because the committee was only put together about 9 months ago. It's a committee of about seven individuals. Ian Bateman, who's one of the key authors of all the work that I worked on. As I say, I am not an economist. I'm an atmospheric scientist by training. Ian was our lead economist. He is on the Natural Capital Committee. So it's a committee of about 3 economists, a couple of natural scientists, an accountant, basically, an appropriate accountant, and a social researcher. And they're currently working out what is the natural capital of the United Kingdom. And they will, as I say, be reporting back to not only the Chancellor of the Exchequer, but other ministers in the Cabinet of are the policies that we've got leading to an improvement in the way we manage our land or not. Now, it's interesting because what was noted by a couple of senior ministers, especially in the Cabinet Office, was if you use this tool, it would be a great way of doing land use planning at a national level, albeit they don't believe in national level planning. But they realise this is exactly the tool you would use for national planning, because their concept is indeed that 1,000 flowers bloom, and locality and local communities are the most important. So it'll be very interesting to see how they bring together their view that indeed they want local decision making, which I understand, not top down, but how to get the sort of information that we've got to inform local decision makers within what I'll call a broad set of goals. But there is now a new policy directive to all government departments that if you make a policy change, you must look at this type of analysis to ask yourself the question, what ecosystem services do you lose by a policy change? And what ecosystem services do you gain by a policy change? And is there a net gain or a net loss economically? One of the project, and then they do it at a project level, a high-speed train from London to Birmingham, what will the implications be of having that high-speed train, and by having to, carve up a piece of the United Kingdom? They will use this type of approach in addition to lots of other economic analysis, say, what are the implications of that high-speed train?
Fantastic. Another question there?
Yes. Sir Robert, thank you very much. Just in relation to the Natural Capital Committee, I read the most recent report, or at least I think it was the most recent report several months ago, and I think they're doing some fantastic work, but I was slightly surprised that they gave so little weight to the whole issue of intrinsic values or things about the natural world that are very difficult to put a monetary value on. There was virtually no discussion of that matter at all, and yet it comes through quite strongly in your presentation. And I wonder, have you been in discussions about that, and why in this most recent report was there so little weight given to the, if you like, the things that we cannot really put a monetary value on?
No, that's a very good point. In fact, the answer is no, I have not been in touch with the committee. One, I used to be the Chief Scientific Advisor at DEFRA, and in that role I would have interacted with that committee quite a lot, as far as it was DEFRA put the committee together jointly with Treasury, so it would report to the Chancellor of the Exchequer as well as to the Minister in charge of DEFRA, the Secretary of State for DEFRA. I left literally days after the committee was formed. I helped to select some of the people, so I left. So I have not talked to them. To be honest, I have not read that last report in detail, but given Ian Bateman's one of my closest friends, I will go back. I've got the report with me, actually. I will read, in fact, I'll read some of it over lunchtime, so if I get more questions like that in the masterclass this afternoon, I'll be able to answer them better. But I'll talk to Ian about it and ask why they never looked at these things that are much more difficult. Probably, to be honest, it's because the people on that committee are hard-nosed economists, the 3 economists, and maybe the social scientists hadn't pushed adequately this whole issue of cultural values and shared values that you can't put into the economic framework. But it's a good point, and I'll certainly bring it up with Ian when I see him next.
One more over there.
Mine's a process question in terms of how the economic valuations were done. As we've heard and know, over the last few days and know anyway, there are a lot of pitfalls with economic valuation. And I've certainly seen a few, what I would call shockers here, of attempts to put value on different ecosystem services. How did you ensure that the valuations were, what was the peer review process, or how did you ensure that you had decent valuations that weren't stupid?
Yeah, no, very good point. Obviously for agriculture, as I said, we used 7 different approaches. For agriculture, it was market value. For recreation, it was on revealed preferences, how we analysed lots and lots of families. To what degree did they take time to go to a local park? Did they take time to go to a river? Did they take time to go to a forest? To what degree were they willing to spend their time? To what degree were they willing to spend money on transportation or when they got there? So we used revealed preferences there based on hard data. When we did the issue of urban green space, in fact, Pavan made a comment yesterday about a house overlooking Central Park in New York, which probably got twice the value of the same house 2 blocks back. We analysed the value or the recent selling price of 1 million houses, and we analysed the selling price of identical houses that were close to a river or close to a park or close to a forest compared to ones that weren't, distance away. And so we worked out the additional value that people were willing to put on green space based on actually a million house prices over the last few years. Heavily peer-reviewed, just like IPCC documents, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. We sent it out for a peer review of experts both in academia, in the private sector and in government. Whether it's a perfect peer review, one could question. It wasn't such an in-depth peer review, in my opinion, as what we did on IPCC or the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which is hundreds and hundreds of reviewers per chapter. But it was heavily peer reviewed, and the expert panel oversaw the peer review process, looked at all the peer review comments and worked with the authors to suggest where changes in their original manuscripts had to be made. So it was a peer reviewed process.
Thank you, Sir Robert. You have travelled from Washington, D.C. to be with us, and I know that that takes the best part of a couple of days, and it was your weekend, and you'll be taking a couple of days to get back, so you've given us a week of your time to give us a few hours of your wisdom. So we're extraordinarily grateful for that. Thank you very much. We have a small gift from you.
Thank you.
And look forward to the discussion this afternoon.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sir Robert. James. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for morning tea. I'd ask that you do 2 things. One is take a few deep breaths and catch your breath from the morning's talk so far, and we'll see you back here sharply at 10:59 for the next session. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. John Morgan is Chief Executive of the National Institute of Water and Atmosphere, or NIWA as we most commonly call them, and they're a sponsor of this event. I'm pleased to introduce John, who will introduce to us a short presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Humankind has long understood that we're imposing stresses on our sometimes fragile environment, with exponential growth in many metrics, increasing pressure on limited resources, huge costs associated with developing alternatives, the increasing demand for energy to power our advancement, the challenges of feeding the world, and the menace of climate change. Now, as mentioned by several presenters yesterday, that when we value or understand something, we tend to take care of it. And when we don't, we risk damaging it or losing it. And in the natural environment, there are many stark examples, I think, of exactly this. I did hear the comments yesterday about the historical approach that put the economy ahead of the environment, and the argument that we need to do the reverse and put the environment first. Well, at NIWA, we tend to think of economic, environmental, and social prosperity as going hand in hand, and not one ahead of the other. Now, while it is true that our natural resources are subjected to increasing demands, we also know that if we can be smarter and more agile, the greater the opportunities they offer to our economic, social and cultural well-being. But the fundamental basis to smart innovation and development is understanding what we're dealing with, the environment we're working in, and how the components interact. I think this is well illustrated by the classic essay written by Charles Lamb back in 1822, some of you may know it, entitled Dissertation on Roast Pork. It was a parable explaining how humanity developed the innovation of cooked food. And Lamb described a primitive time in China thousands of years ago where the people were very poor and lived in little huts and villages, and they ate their food raw, often with no meat. And one day in that village, a father left his house with his son guarding it, but the son accidentally set the house on fire. Now, some of the animals that had been wandering in and out of the house, as they did then, were wandering in the house at the time of the fire, and sadly the family's pet pig was caught in the fire. The father came back distressed and first checked to see that his teenage son was okay, and then started poking around in the ruins, and he happened to stick his finger into the pig that was caught into the fire. Now, of course, it was very, very hot, and his natural reaction was to put his fingers into his mouth to cool it. And it tasted delicious. Hence, they had discovered cooking. And so, from that day on, every time a villager wanted roast pig, they just simply burned their house down. Now, the moral of the story is clearly that if you don't understand why the pig gets cooked, you're doomed to waste an awful lot of houses. Economic development without understanding the impact of our natural environment is a little bit like that. The more we understand it, the less likely we are to burn our natural capital. I liked Pravan's comments at the very end of his speech yesterday where he said, yes, there are challenges, but there are solutions, so let's just work on them. Now, most of you will probably be aware that NIWA has over 600 scientists and technicians with their primary expertise being in freshwater resources and the marine environment, including fisheries, and in climate and atmosphere and renewable energy, and of course biodiversity. So based on our areas of interest, we pulled together a montage of slides which is primarily based on a United Nations report to illustrate that the world continues to change much more rapidly than most of us could ever have imagined. But it also shows that when we understand our natural environment and take action, we can balance the environment and economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks, NIWA, for sponsoring our event as well as for that presentation. Time for panel 3. Kim, back to you.
Thank you, Charles. Follow me. Hi, nice to see you all back here again today, despite the weather. Sorry about the weather. Following through Sir Robert's theme of how we truly evaluate the hitherto invaluable, in both senses of the word, I suppose, in the market system and in Bolivia. I'm joined by Professor Carolyn Saunders, Professor of Trade and Environmental Economics at Lincoln University. She's been, of late, evaluating trade and the environment, and she's carried out research for a range of organizations, including Fonterra and Treasury and the meat industry. David Wansborough is Director of Resource Policy at the Ministry for Primary Industries. Dr. Lynn Roberts is Adjunct Senior Lecturer at the Department of Environmental Management at Lincoln University. She moved from a career in biology through policy analysis. Now she's helping businesses to be sustainable. And Hamish Bohannon has been involved in international mining for 35 years, mainly gold. I think he's now head of Bathurst Resources, and he has also won awards for his environmental management. The format is that each of us panel will speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll kick around some things, and then there will be time for questions from the audience. So let me invite Professor Carolyn Saunders to begin.
Okay, thank you. Good morning. So Richard, thank you so much for your presentation. I thought it was amazing. And just to start, that Ian Bateman, who you mentioned, of course, is an old colleague of mine and as an adjunct position at Lincoln University, and I've got a researcher over there looking to see if we could apply anything like that to New Zealand. And I must admit, first scratches is, where's the data? The richness of UK data. I'd like to do sort of 3 things. One is sort of just reflect. We've had a lot of talk about how do we value nature and how do we value biodiversity and natural capital. And there's a lot of literature in that space, as we know, and reflected on that yesterday. But I also wonder if we're being a little bit hard on ourselves. For my sins, I'm on the Economics Advisory group of statistics for Statistics New Zealand, an amazing body to be on, actually. And it really hits me there that there is a huge amount of work, internationally and nationally, actually just trying to get decent measures of the market impacts of what we do, never mind the non-market. So here we are sort of being, I think, a little bit hard, let me throw that out to the audience, on the work that's been done on trying to get a handle on these non-market valuation techniques. Now, I've worked on them for years, and the first one I did was for DEFRA, then MAF, looking at the policy of environmentally sensitive areas and whether that should carry ahead or not. And yes, there's many bad studies out there, and there's all kinds of strange values that sort of people don't like, or the big numbers. But I think they've got a place, and there's lots of different techniques. It's not one size fits all. Now, as privileged as a role in land care research, to go around and help develop some strategy. And we talk to a lot of stakeholders, and that's one of the great things about my job, to talk to stakeholders across government agencies, NGOs, and the sectors. And one of the key requirements that came out of that hit me in the face is the need to value biodiversity in particular within New Zealand. Now, we might make us feel wiggly and uncomfortable for moral reasons, but there are some real genuine trade-offs here. And so, you know, we are going ahead with the choice modelling technique with all its pluses and minuses, but in particular, that technique helps us look at the trade-offs. And it's with delight we've got Hamish here from Bathurst, because one of the reasons we're interested is how do they take a site that's going to be mined or used and compensate. What's the measure, what's the correct or nearly correct or nearest level of compensation we can do for that. So that's going to be fascinating work, and we held a workshop for the scientists, key scientists in land care in particular, a couple of weeks ago, and usually they've got garlic and crosses when I walked in my room, or I run those, but we came out talking and really moving forward, and ran a workshop with MPI and DOC there, and TB Free on Monday, so the same thing. So let's hope we can keep that action going. And finally, before I get red-chaired, which I'm told is when the chair tips up and I go out, I just want to say my passion for New Zealand is we have the win-win. And so I work a lot in overseas markets, bringing those signals back and increasing value what we get from our exports. And so I worked a lot in the UK thing, and then I get told by the sectors, oh, shut up, Caroline, get back in your box. You're so UK-centric, we're going to feed India and China. So we thought, let's go out and survey India and China. We did a 2-stage process, so just quick results. Obviously, they valued safety very highly. So we did a number of attributes, just giving a couple, you know, at around 73, 74% compared to the UK, 16%. But the one that had eyes popping out when I've taken this back to the boards of the big companies and our meat companies and agricultural ones, is China was willing to pay 22%, and okay, let's call it 20%, but I'm looking at the relativities here for biodiversity. India, between 27 and 42%, and the UK, 6%. This, to me, is the message. Don't stop the conversation by thinking that China and India and these new markets don't care for biodiversity, and we had another of environmental attributes in there. And finally, they are willing to pay 49% extra in China for products from New Zealand. India doesn't like foreign products, rather has its own, but in New Zealand it'll pay 10% more. So again, we have got an advantage to go out there and celebrate and get win-wins based on whether you want to call it clean green image, whatever the attributes we put together in our next stage of research is to dig down and see how those go. So please, can we stop hearing we are a low-cost producer, we should be a high-value producer. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. David.
Hello, everybody, and I'm sorry to be a late ring-in, so I'll explain a bit about who I am. I'm probably actually the right person to be here.
That's what he told me. I said, whatever.
So I'm the Director of Resource Policy at Ministry for Primary Industries, and that's not that meaningful. So how I explain it is that I've got responsibility for climate change policy, water policy, RMA and land use policy from the primary industry point of view, so relatively relevant to this conversation. A little bit about my background. I'm a bureaucrat, and I'm proud to be a bureaucrat. I can tell the difference between good and bad bureaucracy. The issues that I have worked on in my career started with genetically modified food and biotechnology, then went into spraying Auckland with pesticides for 3 years, then a brief stint in just general biosecurity stuff. Then I was National Manager of Immunisation for 3.5 years, then a stint in animal welfare, and now I've got climate change. So I've got the kind of royal flush of controversial issues that involve a lot of scientific and technical stuff, but also what I'd characterise them by as a clash of outcomes, where the outcomes are contested. So I want to talk very briefly, because I've got the red chair warning as well, about 3 things. The first is collaboration. The second is decision-making, and the third is kind of the goals as I see it from the primary sector point of view. True collaboration is really when you actually sit down with someone else and you say, I want to hear what your outcomes are, and I will listen to them and actually accept that they are important outcomes as well. And in return, I want you to accept that my outcomes are important and valid. And this is hard in the natural resource area because the outcomes are contested. Health was a little bit different. Not many people disagree with the outcomes that you're trying to achieve in health. How to do them is hard, and that is hard work. But at least in health, the outcome is at least reasonably agreed. You might have lots of arguments about prioritisation. But in natural resources, you've got what's often described as a clash between economy or an environment or social outcomes, and they are all valid. So if you want to collaborate with someone, you have to acknowledge that validity, accept their outcomes as important, and that's how you find the win-win. And so collaborative processes are really important. Doesn't mean they're easy. They will be really bloody hard, but that's the only way that we're going to get there. Second point I want to talk about is about decision-making. In all of my years as a public servant, I've never been involved in a decision in natural resources area where we didn't think about the environment and the social and the economic impacts. I'm not saying that we got all those decisions right. I'm not saying that our analysis was particularly sophisticated. I mean, often people just come up with arbitrary numbers about how you value the social impacts of something like this, or You know, when we talk about spraying Auckland with pesticides, we were very, very conscious of the social impacts of that. It's not fair or accurate to say that those are ignored in government decision making. Can we make better decisions? Yes, absolutely. We should always strive to do that. We will never finish that task. But don't start from a point of view of saying, oh, it's ignored. You've got to start taking it into account. It is taken into account, but we can do it better. The other thing to remember is that in a sustainable development decision, you could sometimes value the economy over the environment. I have also seen lots of decisions where people have valued the environment over the economy. So the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit about what are the goals for primary industries in this space. And people will have hopefully heard about the goal that our ministry has that's kind of trying to run through and provide a focus for all of our department is on doubling the value of primary sector exports by 2025. That's important. It's hard, it's achievable, and we are going absolutely as hard as we can to do it. And the question for us is, it's not just about volume. It's not just about taking and taking and taking more. A lot of it's about value. Some of it will be about volume. It's not a binary decision. It's not one or the other. But certainly in my space, it's about doubling exports without doubling our footprint. There is lots of room in New Zealand for greater productivity gain. We are not yet at the point where we're having to trade off productivity against sustainability. If we do things more productively, there will be a sustainability benefit for it. The most productive farmers actually happen to have the lowest greenhouse gas emissions and the least nitrate runoff from their farms. The level of technology and sophistication and passion and commitment from the primary production industry is astonishing in this area. And so to get truly good outcomes in here and to achieve the goal of doubling, of both the economic goal that's valid and the sustainability goal that is also valid, we need to bring and work with farming communities, industries, councils, local communities. And there is a lot of passion and commitment there, and we need to bring them along. Regulation, I have keep saying to my people, it's the second worst way of achieving an outcome. Restructuring is the worst, but regulation's the second worst. We should find every other way of achieving our outcome before we resort to regulation. That's all.
Thanks, David. Lynn.
Last week I was reading a column in the press by Rosemary McLeod in which, only slightly tongue-in-cheek, I think, she was ascribing Julia Gillard's deposition as Prime Minister of Australia to the fact that she'd let herself be photographed knitting. Not only knitting, but smiling while she was knitting, and knitting a kangaroo for a royal baby. In a country where sexism is unfortunately still rife, Rosemary argued that a woman leader couldn't possibly let herself be seen practicing the dark art of knitting, a step far too far on the wild side of femininity. When women insisted we were equal, she said, we had to prove it on male terms, not ours. I see similarities in the discussion about ecosystem services. For 30 or more years, our public discourse has been dominated by those who speak the language of economics. If you couldn't present your case in the language of economics, your views or what you valued didn't carry weight. It didn't seem to matter that all the economics had little basis, the economic models had very little basis in biophysical reality. We all seem to get swept away, particularly those of us in the countries dominated by Thatcherism, Reaganism and Rogernomics, by the importance of making whatever we were arguing for make sense in the language of neoclassical economics. Or as Israeli economist Ariel Rubinstein recently described it, the language of our economic fables. The fables have worked their way into our social narratives, leaving many assuming they convey some fundamental truths about the important motivators of human action and the key drivers of our well-being. So ecosystem services provide a really powerful way to try and shift the social narrative. They provide a language for communicating things so many of our urban and even rural populations have forgotten, that as individuals and societies we're completely dependent on nature, and a way to make visible what to many has been invisible, to identify, describe and discuss the various ways in which our well-being is linked to the well-being of our natural systems. They also provide a vehicle, if we choose to use it that way, and this hasn't been mentioned in the conference so far, to encourage and expand the discussion of what is well-being. If we think about what is the problem we're trying to address, the fundamental problem of sustainability is that demand is increasing. There are more and more of us consuming more and more resources, while at the same time the supply of vital ecosystem services is declining. We are causing more and more damage to our life support systems. Talking about natural capital and ecosystem services is talking about how to arrest the downward slope of the supply curve. But if we do nothing about demand, if we're still convinced by the advertisers that consuming more and more stuff will make us happier, then all we're doing is buying a little more time. Which is where I think the language of well-being comes in. Just as there's been an explosion of research on ecosystem services in the last 20 years, there's been an explosion of research on well-being. What do we need to be happy? What do we need to feel a level of satisfaction in our lives? Basically what it comes down to is what a recent Australian study called the Golden Triangle. We need love. All we need is love. Good relationships with friends and family. We need work or other activity which is meaningful so that we feel that there is purpose in our lives, some value in our lives. And we need enough money to meet our basic human needs. And the amount of money we need is surprisingly little. A recent New Zealand study found that the biggest increase in well-being came from moving from an income of just under $30,000 a year to just over $30,000 a year. And after an income of $125,000, there was no significant increase in happiness, no matter how much extra income you add. A case of the poor rich having declining return on increasing income. As we begin to pay attention to what really makes us happy, we become less likely to demand the latest product whose manufacturer has destroyed chunks of natural capital, and instead are more likely to take our kids for a walk on the beach, or go for a tramp in the mountains, or turn a corner of our farm into native bush, and husband our soil because we don't feel driven to wring every last dollar from it. I've had the pleasure this last year to be leading a research project for the Department of Conservation, identifying and compiling the evidence of the extent to which New Zealanders' well-being is linked to our Indigenous ecosystem services. We've discovered some fantastic examples of how the contribution of ecosystem services to different aspects of well-being have been assessed and measured. And in some cases, that knowledge has fed through into elegant and effective changes in policy and practice. And hopefully, at least sometimes, into changes in the worldview of mental models of those involved. It's actually been really exciting to see how the concept of ecosystem services has allowed various individuals and agencies around the country to communicate the importance of nature to a wide variety of different audiences in a language they can relate to because it relates directly to their well-being. For instance, how an unprepossessing mudflat at the head of a harbour in Auckland or the Coromandel relates to the great fishing you can get down on the coast, or how a forest is giving us carbon sequestration but also recreation and habitat for kiwi, or how inter-row planting of indigenous species in a vineyard can increase pest control, or even providing a language to talk about the cultural service of being able to whakapapa back to a particular mountain or stream or plant or animal. Of course, there are completely valid reasons for attempting to express the value of diverse ecosystem services in dollar terms, and Bob and Pavan have given us some great examples of that over the last few days. Or to use a New Zealand Firth of Thames example, how big a rebate to give as an incentive to farmers who plant trees at the top of their catchment because of the savings and flood protection costs it generates down on the plains. But as many speakers have mentioned, there are many pitfalls in placing a dollar value on ecosystem services. Some of the biggest in my mind are how to adequately and fairly address inter- and intra-generational equity. And given there's a strong correlation between high inequality and lowered well-being across a society, we're really not assisting well-being if we start using measures that lead to inequitable outcomes. So unless we have a specific management context that requires converting into dollars, and are sure that we've got some really defensible techniques. Instead of buying into the language of economics and the market, I suggest we stick with the language and metrics that best describes the particular service, whether it's number of species or tons of carbon absorbed or energy flow, the true unit of currency of the planet, and instead focus on how does it contribute to human well-being, that end of the equation. There is a shift in social paradigms underway. Let's use what we're learning about ecosystem services to contribute to changing the social narrative about what things really contribute to our well-being, so we can develop a more sustainable relationship with this lovely planet of ours.
Thank you, Lynn. Hamish.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks, Kim. And yes, I'm Hamish. I'm the miner in the room. I'm not too sure how many corporate representatives and industry representatives we have out here, but I suspect there's not too many of us.
Hands up. Oh, thousands of them. Look
Thousands,
at them.
all. 1 5. I can count that far. I am an engineer. But before I go into who am I and why am I here, I think I'd just like to harp back to Dr. Smith's starting points. He said some fantastic things. In fact, the last day and a half has just been amazing for me. A lot of insights and a lot of truisms. But the one that jumped out from me was when Dr. Smith pointed out that when he was born, there was about 1 billion people on the planet with a reasonable quality of life, and about 3 billion who didn't have that quality of life. It was only in March this year we passed the 7 billion number on the planet. And as Dr. Smith said yesterday, when he comes to the end of his time, which I suspect hopefully will be about the same, because we're about the same age, I think, time as mine, he expects there to be 10 billion people on the planet, of whom 8 billion have a reasonable quality of life. I'm just thinking that through, apart from the fact our lives are expected to live considerably longer than many of our other humans on the planet, quite considerably longer. I think the big one is we've got a huge road to go, and all the staff and amazing processes I've heard about today, I think the thing that comes home to me is we need to get them into place, in traction and happening, not in 5 years' time, not in 10 years' time, tomorrow. I think those slides we just saw now from NIWA really bring it home again. I was down in Antarctica in January. I spent the whole of January down there. You can see the changes. You know, we really are having an impact on this planet, and we all need to be, as we are, and I really appreciate it, now talking and working together to find a solution now, not in 5 years' time, not in 10 years' time. And at the other side, the real elephant in the room is, how do we get to that 8 billion people in 30, 40 years' time who have got a real quality of life, because we don't have it today. So where am I from? I started out as a miner, handhold miner. I was a rise miner. We don't have rise miners today. It's a hazardous occupation. You're basically putting a tunnel straight up and climbing up under the area you've just blasted. So now we've legislated against it, and a good thing too, because we tend to live longer. But I also saw the light and realized that mining and agriculture are very much part of creating a quality of life on this planet. If we can't grow it, we have to mine it. The challenge we have is how can we do it in a sustainable environment? How can we do it in a non-destructive way without permanent destruction? So it comes back to, how do we value what we're doing? What is the total value? And I think that's the real beauty of some of the stuff, the world of Great Britain. You know, some of that stuff absolutely compelling. You probably picked my accent. I am British. I did my first degree at Imperial College and then went on and did others elsewhere. I've been very lucky to work all over the world. Most of my career has actually been in copper. I've worked in gold, platinum, nickel, coal, and I've seen the damage that mining can do. I think anything we do on the planet can cause massive damage. We've talked about agricultural damage, we've talked about resource damage, but we also have that need. So it's giving ourselves the tools, embracing those tools, getting the regulations in place, because one thing that hasn't really come up, I'm sure it's embedded, in fact I know it's embedded in the processes, is ethics. It's one thing for companies to say they'll do things, it's another thing to actually do it. Ethics is vitally important, and the driver of ethics is our regulatory bodies and our whistleblowers and all of that. That's very important. But the real excitement for me here these couple of days is seeing hands-on what we can do today and hearing the willingness to put it in place, because the clock is ticking, we've got the tools, now's the time to get in and use them. Thanks.
Thank you, Hamish. Just a very quick question. You weren't prospecting in Antarctica, I take it?
Oh no, I was very fortunate, like Dr. Robert there, to be with some fantastic film stars, Kiwi ones, Russell Bryce and Lydia Brady.
Yes, all right, that's enough name dropping. This question goes to values that we were talking about. Would you regard Antarctica as utterly out of bounds for mining ever?
I think Antarctica is absolutely fantastic. It must be out of bounds forever. We do need reference, and that is our reference.
All right. David, can I just pick up on something you said? You said we can value, and we do value, have valued, the economy over the environment, and we can also value the environment over the economy. That sounds like it's still binary. When this whole conference is about how it can't be divided up. What do you think?
I think on individual decisions, some of those decisions are value trade-offs, and people can make a value trade-off. But I think overall, you look for win-wins overall. They're not all, every single individual decision might have a tipping point. You might want to go a little bit more economic, a little bit more environmental. You usually have those options, and different people with different value sets will make a different judgment. Different governments with different value sets will make different judgments. So I'd say you look for as much win-win as you can, and then right at the end of the decision there's a little tipping point. You can usually go one way or the other, but there's quite a lot of win-win to be made. But sometimes I see governments and ministers choosing, they're more influenced by one value or another, and people with different value sets can make a different judgment call based on the same information. That is what a judgment call is it's, most decisions are based on uncertainty. You don't, if you knew all of the answers, then it's not actually a decision, it's a no-brainer. Decisions under uncertainty rely on your judgment. Your judgment comes from a value space. Different governments make slightly different value judgments, but overall, what we try to do is to find as much win-win as we can, and at the end there are little tipping points.
I mean, GM, that you said you've been involved in, what's the win-win there?
Well, the Royal Commission on Genetic Modification, which was almost a decade ago, people forgot, it said proceed with caution. And it's a bit like saying, you know, is mining bad? No, it's a bit senseless to say it's binary, it's good or bad. Genetically modified crops in some places have had enormous environmental benefits. Wouldn't you want to...
But that argument is a big loss, listen to them, is a big loss here in New Zealand. It ain't going to happen anytime soon.
I don't think people have found the right product for New Zealand yet.
So what you're saying is that it can be a win-win if only people see your point of view.
No.
You know, because there's an awful lot of wishy-washy stuff going on about consensus and collaboration and win-win and the blah. But when it comes down to it, somebody has to make a decision, and it's going to be based on inadequate data. I mean, it would be fabulous if, you know, what we saw presented to us earlier by Sir Robert, and he concedes, you know, that data is sometimes incomplete and it's still a work in progress, but wouldn't it be great if we had this template, you know, we could say, okay, this is more valuable, and we're obviously going to do that. It's never going to be like that. We're always going to have somebody making a decision we don't like.
Yeah, but that's politics.
I know.
New Zealand's blessed with 4 million individuals with lots of opinions. You know,
just elaborate for me, Caroline, because you were talking about the trade-offs. Those can't be win-win, right? How do you work out what you trade off for what?
Well, so I mean, while I accept very much and really am behind what Lynn was saying about that the ultimate ball is social well-being,
but
integrated
over
with
the
environment.
next 5 years, over the next 20 years,
But,
for our generations
we have to make decisions. We have to prioritise. We can't have, and so what the trade-offs are is, depending on your context, is how are those values relative to others. And this is where the non-market valuation techniques have got their place, because they help inform that decision about prioritisation by looking at community values.
I'm not sure I can see how it's going to happen in a way that convinces people that that's a right process.
It's a political process fundamentally, but what we're hoping, like Bob's work has shown, Richard's work shown, is that that political process, the more we can inform that with imperfect or perfect data, hopefully the better the decision making will be.
Makes your head hurt though, doesn't it? How, I mean, as Sir Robert illustrated, so many variables have to put in, and sooner or later somebody's going to say, oh, we object to that variable, it's not going to be like that, and does your whole model fall apart?
I mean,
more will come in the workshop, of course.
Yeah, obviously the government can make a politician can make a decision as it likes, or whoever the decision maker is. But we keep having this rhetoric in New Zealand, and I'm yet to see evidence-based policy. And if we've got to keep pushing for evidence-based policy and keep pushing for a link to science, and I make my plea that it's not just a link to natural science, it's a link to top economic science and top social science.
And I mean, if there was one message that came out of Sir Robert's presentation, it said it had to be evidence-based. Data was crucial, so we need to keep collecting the data here in New Zealand. Lynn, can I ask you, we've heard that the food production in the world needs to double, and sustainability, according to David, can also be ensured, did you say that, with the doubling of production? Do you believe that?
Let me challenge first the thing that we need to double production. We have enough food. It's just that the main issues are inequitable access to resources to buy the food and issues of waste. So we've got 30% of food wasted before sale in the developed world in terms of poor storage, etc. And we've got 30% of food wasted after purchase in the developed world. You know, all that stuff that sits at the back of your fridge and goes mould at you, those sort of things. We have enormous waste. There's a figure of something like 30%, I'm grasping for a number here, of water used in the US is for food that ends up in the disposal. So it's not actually used. So we need to have a much better system for access to income. So inequitable access of income means some people can't access food, and issues about more efficient production, storage, etc. And I would deal with those ones before I started trying to reap more out of the soil.
But we don't care, David, about how much food's wasted, do we? We just want to sell more.
I mean, our goal is not to double production. It's to double the value that we get from it. And part of that is to use our inputs more efficiently. There's lots to be gained there about using the soil and the water much more efficiently than we do at the moment. There is lots of room for us to do that.
Right.
And you know, we're only going to supply enough food for a very small part of the world. We produce enough food for something like 7 or 8 times our population. Not many countries do that, but it's a small chunk of the world's population, and we might get to choose who we sell to.
Carolyn, you were talking about China. Just clarify this for me. China is prepared to pay how much of a premium for biodiversity? And how does that manifest itself, and who measures it?
In manifest itself in?
Yeah, how?
22%, let's say, but it's an order of magnitude, let's say 4 times that the UK is.
But who decides on the price, and what biodiversity are they measuring? What's that process?
This is the next stage of the work. This work was to keep the conversation going against what's kicked back by some of the sectors, is that these countries don't care. It's only rich countries or older countries like the UK, more developed countries, that care about these attributes. And this research said, no, these countries care very much. And pick up David's point that we could enhance a lot more value out of our product into the market, and James alluded to that yesterday, by capturing the value, 1, by having a more sensible value chain, and 2, by saying these attributes in the market, finding exactly what they are, and then selling back and obtaining those premiums.
All right, because you're saying that they are out there to be paid, if only we
Yes.
can. All right. Can I ask you, Hamish, have you been involved in coal mining at all?
Absolutely, I am involved in coal mining now.
Coal mining now. That's not good, right?
Burning fossil fuels is not good.
Right.
But just to go back to the first presentation, 600 million people in India don't have access to power. So how do they keep the food fresh? So we've got to go very quickly down a path of getting alternate fuel sources. We need that energy to have a quality of life. And it is all about well-being. It's all about getting a better quality of life for everyone on the planet, not just the lucky ones here or in other first world countries.
Yeah, but
We've got to go down that journey.
The obvious interruption, and I have to make it because here I am, is that you're not going to be improving anybody's quality of life by enhancing the advent of climate change, which is what fossil fuels are going to do, right? So I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying how do we measure it? Advantage, disadvantage.
That's what this is all about.
Yes.
And that's what's so relieving, exciting about where we're at today. We're now starting to really put these measures in place. The reality, no one wants to have a lotto that says, right, we've got 400 people here, only 60 of us can have power. Which ones aren't going to have it? Who's not going to have a television, fridge, a car, and anything else? We're not going to turn it off today. We've got to turn it off very quickly, and we've got to find alternative sources. That's what it's about. It's as
so
Dr.
you
Smith
see
said.
coal as transitional.
Absolutely.
But maybe we haven't got time for that transition. Maybe we haven't got time. How do you measure how much time we've got?
I think the measuring of time is for the scientists, and it would appear to be
Well,
not,
I think
not
the scientists
long
have
at all.
measured it, actually.
It's not long at all. We're
No.
talking, we need to make a change now because on the J-curve, we haven't got time to make a change in 10 years' time. We're past the critical point. So what we need to be doing is exactly how do we stop our demand? There's heaps of coal out there. We could stop mining coal in the first world countries. It's still going to come from Mozambique. It's still going to come from Mongolia. It's still going to come from Southern Africa. There is enough of it out there, and people are hungry. People need power. People need heating. They need all those things. What we have to do is very quickly find alternative sources and also be much, much smarter about the way we use it. Stop our demand, cut our demand back. Let's go to LEDs. Let's really be smart about turning lights off in the city. Wellington's bright every night. You drive back in. It was quite interesting. Thursday, a fortnight ago, during that horrendous storm, I drove back in from Palmerston North, and I realised in the city before I was there, sort of thing, because all the lights were out. It was quite refreshing. You know, how many officers do turn their lights out at night as soon as they leave the office? You don't even have to look around in the evening. It's not happening. That's what we've got to do. We've got to tackle it from all ends, and we've got to do it now.
Is Bathurst putting anything into renewable energy sources?
At this stage, we're not doing too much at all. We're waiting to start. Our coal...
Waiting for how long, do you think?
Oh, who knows? Who knows? But the key thing is coal is more than just power. It's also for steel. It's also for cement. And there's great theories out there, and we're working on them. Can we get charcoal to replace carbon in steel? In the tests, we can. On the field pilot schemes, we can. There's the other half of the balance, and this again is where it's so important. Are we going to build or plant, I should say, more plantations? We've got plantations now for paper industry, for pulp industry. We've got plantations in West Africa. My son lives in West Africa. Plantations for fuel oils from oil palms displacing food. This is the questions we've got to, these are the balances. We need to be talking constructively, openly, and getting the solutions today.
What, you're contributing to climate change and your son's displacing food?
No, my son lives in West Africa. He can see the food being displaced.
Okay, no, just checking. The sins of the fathers and all that. Lynn, can I check the growth thing with you? Because, I mean, Nick Smith said yesterday, the Minister of Conservation, he told us that low growth or no growth does not benefit the environment. And in a way, that's what Hamish is saying. He's saying, you know, you can stop the clock, but there are still going to be people who need stuff, not just want stuff, need stuff. And so we need a transition. What's your view of growth? What good growth? What bad growth?
Yes, it was really interesting hearing Nick Smith, who is an engineer, and so you'd think he'd understand some basic laws of thermodynamics and so on. And in terms of, you know, you just basically logically can't have continued exponential growth in a closed system. So at some point, it's got to level off. And you know, also he was referring to the Limits to Growth book, and you did wonder whether he'd actually read it. But I think we have to come to terms with the fact that there are limits to growth in stuff and people. You know, the planet is only so big, you can't keep filling it up. But there are no limits to development, and so we can keep on doing enhancements of, you know, art, literature, music, love, creativity, all sorts of things. But I've been fascinated by the discussion over the course of the last couple of days that instead of, we're just so hooked on growth. It's implicit paradigm. No politician could be elected without saying I'm for growth. You know, we all believe it's a good thing, it seems. And so I'm wondering whether, and even the people who've been talking the very learned people have been talking about good growth and bad growth as opposed to saying no growth. And I'm wondering whether that's relating to Tim Jackson at the Parliamentary Commissioner's 20th anniversary a few years back had this lovely line about the language of limits is not the language of the human heart, that we can't actually cope with the idea that we can't continue to expand. And so I was wondering whether the development of this idea of inclusive wealth was in fact a way of sort of subtly avoiding talking about something not being able to grow, because within that you could have, by having a bucket that's covering both economic, social, natural, etc., you could have a situation where economic growth is slowing or stationary, but that natural capital and social capital and all these other capitals are growing, and so we can still feel we're growing, and we still don't have to give up the idea of attachment to expanding and growing.
But again, we'd have to go away from the GDP. You know, you
We
can't
have
constantly measure things with that inaccurate measurement.
And that was part of, you know, but I had to cut out to keep within the 5 minutes. But GDP, you know, there's this recognition that GDP is not an adequate measure, and so we're looking at alternate ones because we're realising it doesn't actually track well-being. And one of the a questioner yesterday picked up a point that I don't think, if I understood the questioner correctly, Jonathan and Pavan didn't quite get what he was getting at, that when we're at a time, as we are, of declining energy return on energy investment, that we've gone from a period of 100 to 1 return on energy investment when we had gushing oil wells, and so there was a lot of spare energy in the system, and that could be used for lots of material goods, but also roads and airports and all sorts of other things. We're now at a point of 20 to 30 energy return on energy investment, 10 to 20, and heading rapidly towards things that are only 3 units of energy return from every energy investment, like the tar sands, and going out in the deep oil wells in the Gulf and so on. So we're moving into a time where there is much less free, cheap energy around, and it's the cheap energy that has allowed us to do all sorts of capital infrastructure investment and all sorts of things. So we have to start working out how we're going to live a life with using a much less energy-intensive life. And how do we set up systems? We don't build motorways. You start working out how to have compact, happy cities without large lots of energy being used. So we do have to start quite rapidly making a change to having a different design of our lifestyles.
Let me get a quick check from you, Carolyn, about growth. You know, people still do talk about it, but we hedge our bets now. And as Lynn points out, for the last, the age of the fossil fuels is presumably coming to an end in terms of cheap and available. So we have to reassess our measurement of growth anyway. What will we replace it with?
Well, and I think you've seen the work in the UK, and as Lynn's referred to, there's been a huge wealth of literature and actually informing policy making on measuring it as well-being and not just GDP.
That's like the business confidence index, isn't it, really?
Well, it's there's lots of ways of doing it, and Stats New Zealand have been working on it, and it's just magic seeing. I mean, do we comprehend what's going on at Treasury at the moment with Girrell stuff? Do you realise what a huge shift in culture that would be for New Zealand, and how he is fighting to get that culture through so that he is measuring economic activity in New Zealand alongside and with all those other things. So every policy in New Zealand gets taken through that lens. That's a huge step forward. And then another thing about economic growth, what we find as you, and I really accept what Lynn's saying, that the happiness falls off at pretty low income levels, no matter what country you're talking about. is the resource intensity of what we do and what we have. And the resource intensity tends to drop as we get richer. But one of the biggest issues I've got is you've got these countries who, so we are getting less resource intensive because we do go for walks in national parks. We do take the kids for walks by rivers. But what can you do with countries like China and India? Do you say, stop it? These people are, suddenly wanting what we've taken for granted, a fridge,
And this is
a
the
telly.
point that Hamish was making earlier,
Yeah,
really.
and how do we deal with that? And to be honest, I'm amazed at how they themselves are dealing with it, probably better than we are in terms of trying, and I'm not saying it's not a huge problem, to put in environmental policies, trying to think of the consequences of their actions. But that big hump as those countries come through, I think is one of the most nervous bits I have about growth.
Don't give them fridges, they'll only have food rotting at the back of them. We have questions
Good point.
from the floor. If you have a question, advance on the microphone in an orderly fashion.
And all run at once.
Who's that? Alan Marks.
Yes.
Here he goes. Throwing coffee over people as he wends his way, ladies and gentlemen, to the microphone. Welcome, Alan.
Yeah, thank you, Kim. Alan Mark, Otago University. My question is addressed to Hamish in particular, but I was very impressed that he addressed the issue of ethics. I was very impressed that he was unfavourably impressed by the Niwa documentary. And we're here to value nature, not to price nature. But I was a member of the appellants to the Environment Court on the Denniston Plateau proposed mining. My role was to look at the international significance of the unique ecosystems and biodiversity of the Denniston Plateau. Those values were accepted by the consultants for the applicant. They were taken to the Environment Court. The Denniston has very unique biodiversity and very unique ecosystems. It's only 1,700 hectares. And my question is, was that a wise choice? I know it's got an area of high quality coal, but given the biological values, the unique biological values, given the ethics of it and the values there, was that a wise choice in terms of exploiting a considerable area in the centre of that plateau and basically destroying those values? Hamish, thank you.
Thank you, and I think very good question, and really that's what this larger debate that's going on here is about. How do we balance those values, and how do we ensure there is responsible use of total resources? And I think this is, liked what you were saying there, Lynn, it's all about how GDP doesn't apply. There will be a new measure of GDP. What is wrong with zero growth? So to Denniston in particular, what is the appropriate offset, the appropriate balance? That's what's still being determined. It's still going through the Environment Court. Obviously, we and my team believe that there is a balance and there can be a net gain. That's still to be determined, and it'll be happening. This process that we're talking about these 2 days in particular will really help us have numbers, have some certainty about the decisions we're making, so we make better decisions going forward. It is an imperfect world, and there has to be a balance. Are we going to turn off the lights for the community on the West Coast? Are we going to have a loss of some biodiversity values? That's the question, hasn't been answered yet.
Stefan, is it?
Yes.
Is that?
I wanted to comment on something that you said, Hamish. I mean, the way you put it was basically that the coal industry would love to, stop mining, but, if you do, then the lights go out. And I have a problem with both those statements because, first of all, I mean, they're perfectly fine passive houses. The lights won't go off. I have a friend who lives off-grid, no problem, nice warm house. The second thing is that you basically imply that, if it's basically a humanitarian act of the coal industry to mine because, but in fact, that you would love to basically stop mining. Now that is in contrast to what Piven said yesterday, where he said in Washington they have 3,500 lobbyists basically pushing the government to mine whatever they can, as long as they can, and 5 people basically lobbying for a clean industry. So, I mean, surely, I mean, unless I have a misunderstanding here, those 3,500 people aren't lobbying for clean energy, are they? So I would, I don't know, I would just like if you could explain that to me, that both those statements, please.
Yeah, thank you, Stefan. You know, great. We would all love to have sustainable housing, and it can be done in the right place with the right support systems around us. We've got to that point, and here in New Zealand, we're far more advanced than many other places in the world. If you go, I've spent a fair bit of time in Niger. They are really struggling to get any quality of life there. So it's not practical in Niger to build a house today or a home today in that capability. So it's not, it can be done, and we commend it, and we should really strive to do it. I don't have a problem with that. That's keen. My own old place in Western Australia, we have no piped water. We're totally off the system. We do get power coming in, but nothing else. So the striving to get there with solar cells and everything else, I'd probably have got to be sustainable too. But it's a goal for all of us. We've got to get there. Until we need that, we need power. Coal mining, I think it's not, I'm not talking for the whole of the industry. And I think we need to get the whole of the industry there. I think it's an absolute given. We cannot continue burning fossil fuels as we are. I don't think there's any debate. We're not the tobacco industry. We're not going to say, hang on, there's a statistic that might unlink health and smoking. The statistics are there. There is no debate on climate change. So we need to move away from coal as a power source and ultimately coal as a chemical reagent or reductant for steel manufacture, for cement and the other niche areas, silicon manufacture that it's in. We've got to go down that path. We haven't got there today. So people are still saying we need coal to fill the energy gap. And at the moment, unfortunately, because we haven't got to the point where we're dropping our demand, our introduction of new power sources is really battling to keep up with the increasing demand. We've got to change that dynamic, and that's what we'll do together.
Lynn?
There may be no debate in the scientific community about climate change, but there's a lot of uncertainty in the general public about climate change, and largely that has been because of an enormous amount of funding put in by the fossil fuel industry, particularly in the States, into generating doubt using the tobacco industry's approach. So a recent study came up with that 97% of scientists, all scientific papers over the last, I can't remember how many years, were supporting the anthropogenic climate change, but that the general public thought it was 47%. Thinking that there was, because, you know, always two sides are presented, and a lot of money has gone into presenting alternatives.
Which comes back to ethics. Which comes back to ethics. And I think the big one that jumps out to me from these couple of days is data. I was absolutely, Sir Robert's information on the UK, what amazing network of data that's turned into information. We need to do the same here. We need to do it on a global basis. So we are talking facts that aren't disputed, that can't have holes driven through them, and so on and so forth. I thought the Puma example that we saw yesterday morning was fantastic. We need to embrace that. We aren't all in one page yet, but if we keep banging the table, if people from industry are prepared to come out and take the hits, we will get there. We've got to hit this crusade relentlessly.
You may well feel picked on a bit, Hamish. I mean, there are people who regard the dairy industry as almost as damaging as the mining industry. I just thought I'd throw that in. Madam, question.
Good morning. My name's Liz Duggan and I work for the Auckland Council. But my question is, I guess, to the panel as a whole, but it leads on from Professor Marx's question. And that is around biodiversity and with respect to policymakers having the idea that there should be no-go areas. I would like to know what the panel thinks of that. And I'm afraid, Hamish, I would particularly like to know your views and the coal mining industry's views, really. Thank you.
Carolyn?
Oh, definitely. Obviously, Antarctica is just a classic example. I mean, we go on about the market as though it's this some sort of amorphous thing, but it only behaves if we give it permission to. So in New Zealand, we've taken a stand and said no nuclear power. And so we have to be very clear about what areas that are actually no-go. Yep. David?
I don't know. I think the government policy is to have some no-go areas, but I guess biodiversity also exists in some of the places that aren't in national parks. And so how do we protect biodiversity that is already on farmland and lowland areas in particular where people are living? Live in Wellington and seen the recovery of Kaka and Tui from around the Karori Sanctuary. So I don't know, complicated answer. I think the government has some areas of no-go. I don't know what the answer is.
Absolutely some no-go areas, but I think the other issue is as we spread understanding about our dependence on Indigenous biodiversity and all the rest of it, that will hopefully address what you've just raised about that there needs to be also biodiversity everywhere. We need to be valuing it everywhere it is.
I'm with the team. I think absolutely there are no-go areas. I commented on Antarctica before. I think the point is that those when areas are no-go, it needs to be worked with the local communities in that area. There is sacrifices. We've made it on the West Coast already with the timber industry. That's a no-go area. We've done it. If there are areas that are no-go, that needs to be stated no-go, and that's the way it is. No problem with it.
You're still there? Have you got a follow-up question? Feel free.
No, not particularly, but when the first answer was coming through, I was thinking, yep, Antarctica is a given no-go at this point in time, but I suspect pressure will come on, that those policies will potentially change, hopefully not. But I really wanted to look more at the, I guess, the temperate biodiversity and what, if we have a no-go areas, what would they actually look like and how would we establish them? I mean, national parks at this stage, yes, but almost no. Conservation land, conservation foreland, yes, but almost no.
Does it not, this is, sorry to interrupt, but does it not, I'm just thinking about, Sir Robert's maps based on, climate change data and over time and in 50 years' time and things will look like this. Do we not always need that level of flexibility? Because climate will change, biodiversity will change, populations will change. Is there any sense in saying this is a no-go area forever and woe betide the government that tries to change that? Sorry to put you on the spot, I just thought I'd say
fine.
that.
I do have to think a little bit about my answer to it. I think there is sense in having definite no-go areas, even with the fact that time will change what is actually there. In part because if we do a trade-off process, what you actually try and recreate is significantly different to what existed and has been changing for evolutionary processes. And in part because I'm not sure what my other part is actually.
All right. Can I say one thing that I was really struck by from Bob's speech this morning was the importance of scale and choosing the different scale for different policies.
Yes.
And I think that's really profound, and we're grappling with that. You heard the Environment Minister talk about some national directions and some local directions. How do we have collaboration at a local level? Finding the right geographic scale is important. The other thing I'd add to that is finding the right social scale is important, because people, in our work, we talk about what do we want from dairy farming, and the answer is not all dairy farmers are the same. There's a whole lot of them who are actually doing really fantastic, amazing, high-tech, sustainable stuff, and there are some who aren't. And in fact, they need completely different policies and interventions. And so scale, both in terms of different policies for different geography and different policies for different groups of people, is actually really important.
Thank you for that. I'm going to get the red chair, and so I have to stop now. Thank you all. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hope you enjoyed the rest of the day. We'll be back this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, panelists. That's a great way to spend the morning. A couple of housekeeping messages very quickly. First of all, although I'm not totally sure I can see easily with the lights on me, if you're not warm enough, could you please put up your hand? We may be able to do something about that. I'm not entirely sure. I don't see a huge number of hands, but I certainly see some. All right. Thank you. Just a quick reminder that there are toilets on 2 levels, not just one. We'd like to start again promptly at 12:44, so we look forward to seeing everyone back here at that time. Thank you.